Hello, and welcome to the Messy Minded Podcast. I'm Jess, and if you have a cartoon brain like me and like learning about a variety of topics, then you are in for a treat. I have a habit of getting distractedly interested in a person or event and want to dive in and explore it until I feel like I have my answers. I'm brand spanking new to this, so be kind. For my first topic, I've selected the Discovery of Iceland. Since visiting Iceland last fall, I wanted to look up some things about it. I had went with my family. We went to the Blue Lagoon and swam in that sort of ghostly, milky blue water. If you haven't seen it, you should really Google it. Go look up just Blue Lagoon, Iceland. It really is kind of a unique place. And actually, on our way to the Blue Lagoon, we drove past an active volcano, which none of us had seen before, so it was sort of wonderful and scary at the same time. Like, we knew that they could be a bit unpredictable, but it seemed distant enough from where we were, and other people didn't seem too bothered by it. But at least speaking for myself, I felt like I definitely didn't want to hang out there a lot. Like, I feel like I wanted to get away from it. That said, it was really cool to see. While waiting in line to go to the lagoon, someone with a clipboard announced that although they're keeping an eye out for danger, they expect it to be safe enough to enjoy the day. And it was. We had a great time. Less than 2 months after I got home, I saw on the news that the volcano's eruption had led to a lava flow actually reaching the Blue Lagoon that we were all just at. And just a reminder how temperamental Iceland can be. But we really did have a lovely time, and I encourage people to go. My joke has been that it's a place where everyone should visit, but no one should live there. We stayed in one of those dome cabins that are mirrored from the outside, and inside, you get a full view of the sky. Very cool. That's more like the, southwest. For the most part, we stayed in the middle bit of the island that's more mountainous and explored the thermal vents and waterfalls. Had some amazing hikes and views, did some snorkeling. Iceland's landscape feels so appropriately mythic that I kind of get why people believe in elves and gods. The country sits right on the mid-Atlantic ridge where tectonic plates pull apart. So you've got lava fields, bubbling vents, glaciers, and waterfalls all in one afternoon. Oh, fun fact, some areas with the thermal vents smell of fart due to the sulfur. So that's endless fun to accuse your friends of, crop dusting while on a hike. We finished up by staying at Reykjavík itself and enjoyed the city vibes for the last few days before going home. We went to a business called Flyover Iceland that was really cool. It has like a wraparound screen that gives you an experience of flying around the island in all different areas. And like the seats move and you get a spritz of water now and again. It's great. Anyway, I've been meaning to look up Iceland and how it was found and who settled there. And I'm finally getting to it. It is a remote island and you do feel a sense of remoteness. And I don't know the word, it feels otherworldly. It's located in the North Atlantic Ocean, and people associate it for its stunning landscapes and volcanic activity. I think it's kind of fun to know how a place was settled, though. I'm not sure if it's accurate to say how a place is settled gives you insights about how its people are the way they are. I've heard that said about Americans, that because of our ancestors taking the risk of leaving their communities to live somewhere new, that accounts for us being a bit more risk tolerant. There might be something to that. I don't know. The stories I found on the Discovery of Iceland is attributed primarily to Norse explorers, although there are indications that other people may have visited the island earlier. I had trouble finding records of anyone before the Norse explorers, though. Here I'm going to be slightly vulnerable and admit my ignorance. I had to look up whether the Norsemen and Vikings were one and the same. It makes sense that Viking is a term used more for raiders, and Norse just means a Scandinavian. So I guess all Vikings were Norse, but not all Norsemen were Vikings. It gets a little blurred for me since Vikings also farmed and were craftsmen. But I also read that a person might be referred to as quote-unquote going Viking, like they're on the hunt for treasure and people. I also found reference to settlers of Iceland that were known to be Vikings, but really only raided a bit during their younger years. I prayed to the ChatGPT gods for clarity, and it said, essentially, that many Norsemen would become Vikings temporarily, then return to farming in the winter. So being a Viking was more of an occupation or activity than some sort of ethnic identity. It's just one of the many things that I kind of knew, but I wasn't sure where the line was. Because when we say Viking, it's easy to picture a guy in a horned helmet screaming on a boat. But most of them spent way more time farming, raising animals, and trying not to freeze to death. The raiding was more like seasonal freelance work. Like they have a summer pillaging gig and winter turnip farming. I feel like these people might have had a good work-life balance. But once they arrived in Iceland, people built turf houses, which are basically hobbit homes. These are half dug in the ground, insulated with layers of earth and grass. We saw some. They were pretty cool looking. Functional, yes. Cozy, depends on how you feel about sharing your bedroom with goats. No judgment here. And here's something I really didn't expect. Women in early Iceland had legit rights. Like, I'm divorcing you and taking the sheep level rights. They could inherit property, manage farms, and even represent themselves in court, which was not at all common across Europe at the time. Speaking of courts, by the year 930, you remember what you were doing in 930, I'm sure, Iceland had formed one of the world's first parliaments. It was basically a giant annual meeting held outdoors where everyone gathered to settle disputes, recite laws, and make deals. It was their Coachella, but with more wool, more axe wounds, and a general sense of order. So yeah, the early Icelanders weren't just raiders and tough guys. They were also law nerds, landowners, and parents trying to keep livestock alive in a land where sometimes the ground freezes, sometimes catches fire. Before we really tuck in here, I just wanted to say that upon reading up on this, I came across a lot of difficult to pronounce words and names. So I'm going to apologize for butchering them right now. There are a couple of Greek names and obviously loads of Icelandic names that my dumb American mouth struggles with, so I'm going to do my best, but that's not likely to be good enough. So I did look up pronunciations for anything that I didn't know, but I found several different versions online. So in some cases, I just picked a pronunciation to use, or I went with the English version of an Icelandic word. So I'm sorry for any miscommunications here. Also, I suppose I should say that I did research this, but I'm no expert, so feel free to fact check me. So before Norsemen set foot on Icelandic shores, there were vague references to mysterious land in ancient texts. The Roman historian Pliny the Elder, in his work Natural History, from 77 to 79 AD, mentioned a land called Thule, which some scholars believe could refer to Iceland or another northern region. Also, the Greek explorer Pytheas of Massalia, during his voyage around 325 BC, I saw he spoke of a distant land far to the north, which he also named Thule. It's uncertain if these accounts particularly refer to Iceland, but they do suggest the idea anyway of a northern landmass that existed in the minds of the early Europeans. They aren't credited for settling it, but I found references to Irish monks that are believed to have lived in Iceland before the Vikings, sometime in the 8th century. But there's not a lot of documentation on them that I could find. They were likely hermits or living in small communities of people seeking isolation for religious reasons. The want for these Christian monks to seek isolation can loosely be thought of as related to Jesus' 40 days and 40 nights in the Judean desert. But given Ireland was and still is a bit short on its supply of deserts, some monks took to the sea to find their version of this. And they would focus on prayer, meditation, self-denial, reflection, in order to grow closer to God. It's believed that the monks were in Iceland for decades and left either because of increasing Viking raids or just because Iceland got more populated by Norse settlers and one quote I saw, quote unquote, became less supportive of their isolated lifestyle. Although this is difficult to think of where else they would go that's better than Iceland. Maybe Greenland? It's not documented well, but some probably did go to Greenland. But most went back to Ireland or the Faroe and British Islands, from what I can tell. And since we're talking about mysterious lands and elusive monks, I want to dip my toe, just a toe, into Icelandic folklore because, let me tell you, this place has stories. Iceland's famous for the Haudafolk, literally hidden people. Spelled Fuldufolk. Hidden folk are kind of like elves or nature spirits that live inside rocks and hills. Rewinding briefly to my little visit there, we had gone on a walking tour in Reykjavík, and our guide delighted us with stories of elves and giants. At one point, I realized that his stories included past and present tenses. Not uncommon for a storyteller, but it prompted me to ask if there's people today who still believe these stories. He said that not only does he think the majority still hold at least some beliefs of the old stories, but it's discussed openly and not laughed about. There are actual cases where roads were rerouted or construction was delayed because people believed it might disturb the hidden folk. Back at our Airbnb, I found YouTube footage of a newscaster reporting on whether or not a road can be moved to accommodate a growing area in the city, due to there being an elf stone in the way. Our tour guide also mentioned that there's an elf council, like a person who talks to the elves, and I really need to look more into that. I'm so curious. I have so many questions. Anyway, I was raised religious, so I can understand how if you're from there, you grow up just knowing and believing these stories, but just for fun, picture this. If you lived there and worked construction, let's say, and let's say your foreman's from another country, imagine trying to explain to your boss why the new highway can't go through because it might upset a rock elf. There's also Yule lads, Iceland's 13 holiday goblins who show up before Christmas and leave little treats, or rotten potatoes. Each one has a weird hobby, which their names helpfully describe. There's door slammer, sausage swiper, and my personal favorite, spoon licker. Just licking spoons for 13 straight nights. It must have been like being haunted by a frat house. I think it's possible the monks might have left less because of Viking raids and more because they were tired of being haunted by butter thieves. The most widely accepted narrative of Iceland's discovery involves Norse explorers from Scandinavia, mostly Norway. According to the Icelandic sagas, particularly the Landnema book, the Book of Settlements, the first Norseman to deliberately sail to Iceland was Nadad, or Norwegian Viking. Around the year 860 AD, Nadad was reportedly blown off course while sailing from Norway to the Faroe Islands. He eventually landed on the eastern coast of Iceland, which he named Snyland? Might have been Snyland. Or Snowland, because of the snow-covered mountains that he saw. It looks like he only stayed on Iceland for a few days, or maybe a few weeks before returning to Norway. So it's possible that I was there longer than he was, but I doubt any history books will reflect that. Following Nadad's accidental discovery, another Norseman, I saw it was either Gadar or Gardar Swarveshan. Ugh, I feel like my Swedish friend is just rolling her eyes at me right now. So I'm going to go with Gardar Sarverson. Ugh, I'm just going to say Gardar from now on. So sorry, everybody. He explored the island more thoroughly around 870 AD. Gardar circumvented the island, confirming that it was indeed a separate landmass. He spent a winter in a place now known as Husavik and built a house there. Gardar was so impressed by the island, he renamed it Gardar's Isle. The name Iceland is a tribute to a different explorer, Flóki Vilgerðarson, also known as Raven Flóki, who Flóki from the show Vikings was loosely based on. Such a good show. According to the sagas, Flóki set sail from Norway with the intention of settling in this newly discovered land. His navigation techniques really pleased me because it sounds so piratey. He brought with him 3 ravens, which he released as he went to help guide his voyage. The first raven flew back to the Faroe Islands, the second returned to a ship, but the third led Flóki to Iceland. Flóki and his crew settled in the northwest of the island, in a fjord they named Vatsfjordur. Our boys found themselves dealing with some harsh conditions and an overall difficult winter that they weren't prepared for, and many of Flóki's men and livestock died. It sounds like a really rough time, and these guys and Flóki were really miffed by all the struggle and loss. He named the island Iceland for its icy and generally unforgiving nature. Despite this, Flóki's experience and accounts of this time didn't deter future settlers, and Flóki himself even returned to live there. I couldn't find out how long he lived there the second time, but it's likely that he went back to Norway afterwards and is probably buried there. I saw the quote, "Encouraged by the tales of fertile land and potential opportunities, North settlers began to arrive in Iceland in the late 9th century," unquote. I'm not sure about the fertile land part. Maybe the land has changed dramatically over the years due to the volcanic activity there, but from what I saw, there was a lot of area that had little to no topsoil. So the fertile ground availability may be just dependent on where you were on the island. I did see reference to there being woods in the southeast part of Iceland, so there are places where there's enough soil for trees to grow. We didn't see the whole island, so I don't know. Anywho, the settlement period known as landnam, or land taking, I saw is dated from 874 AD to around 930 AD. One of the most notable settlers was my guy, Ingólfur Arnarson, who is often considered the first permanent settler of Iceland. He arrived 10 to 15 years after Flóki's failed attempt. I searched for his age from when he arrived to Iceland and kept finding that he was in his 30s or 40s. But since he was apparently born in 849 and arrived in Iceland in 874, my math has him just around 25 years old, which explains a lot when it comes to how he found himself in Iceland instead of his home in Norway, but I'll get to that later. According to the sagas, as Ingólfur's ship approached Iceland, he threw his high seat pillars overboard. Those are symbolic wooden columns, like they're They were carved pillars that had family name and representation of the gods prominently featured on them. He threw those overboard when he sighted land, vowing to settle wherever they washed ashore. He eventually settled in what is now Reykjavík, Iceland's capital. Reykjavík means smoky bay, referring to the smoke from the thermal activity there. Now, the idea that someone was a leader of men would choose where to settle based off where pillars would end up on the land was absolutely ridiculous to me at first blush. I'd think it would make much more sense to land and then look to see where might have trees or natural shelter, where the ground soil is thick enough for planting, where is there fresh water, etc. But not just throwing a metaphorical dart at the board. But I have to remember who, more so when, we're dealing with. At the time, humans were much more tribal, and their religious beliefs were largely elemental. They'd pray to various gods and spirits for safety, good harvest, protection, victory in battle. So it clicked for me that throwing the pillars into the ocean, it was him putting his fate into the hands of the gods, which hopefully would bring him good luck. And I found that this was actually a pretty common custom. So Ingólfur interested me because he apparently is from a respected family in Norway with ties to the ruling class. So he had inherited enough social standing and wealth to gather a crew and resources and slaves that were needed to establish a new settlement. I didn't find a detailed list of what he would have brought with him, but he would have brought a variety of things like livestock, cattle, sheep, pigs, horses, some tools, like plows, axes, sickles, swords, spears, shields, lots of S's. Building materials, saws, hammers, nails, food supplies like dried fish, meat, salted pork, and grain for bread making and porridge. Clothing like woolen clothing, leather and fur, and slaves. So after reading this, I was like, how big were his ships? I found that they were likely about 50 to 100 feet long and 13 to 16 feet wide. It could hold anywhere from 20 to 60 men plus provisions. I saw one place that said 100 men, so they were sizable ships. Probably pretty tight quarters, though. Ingólfur was thought to have had 2 slaves, and his buddy, Leif, I saw also known as Leif the Sword. Leif is thought to have had about 24 slaves. Leif's given name was too difficult for me to master, but I'm happy to spell it for you fine folks. It's H-J-O with the umlaut, R-L-E-I-F-U-R, and last name is H-R-O-D-M-A-R-S-S-O-N. But that's too hard for me to say, so Leif it is. Slaves were also referred to as thralls, which is a cool guy word that means state of being in someone's power, but I thought it was interesting and news to me that you can also be enthralled to anything that holds you captive or controls your thoughts or actions, like addiction or disease. Just a fun little tidbit for you. So let's go back to why our new good friend Ingólfur had left his home in Norway in the first place. Essentially, he was involved in a blood feud. If you're not familiar, blood feuds are long-standing conflicts between families. They tend to be a family member seeking revenge for some slight, then the other family take revenge for that attack. Just a cyclical fighting thing. The Hatfields and McCoys come to mind. As long as we are talking about terms involving blood, Ingólfur and his boy Leif were blood brothers, meaning that they swore an oath of brotherhood to each other. I also read that they were brothers-in-law as well because Ingólfur was married to Leif's sister, so they had each other's backs either way. I found conflicting stories about what this feud was about, but it started when Ingólfur's family clashed with another powerful family, quote-unquote leading to deadly conflict, which is a polite way of saying Ingólfur and Leif killed the sons of a Norse earl. Our guys had to give up their land to the earl, but with no land left of his own, and to avoid further retaliation or legal punishment, since, like I said, those feuds often spun into endless cycles of revenge, the Blood Brothers left Norway and sailed west following a rumor of uninhabited land. This is what I was referring to earlier about his age making some sense here, because I can just picture a couple of broy Norse nobles getting into scrapes without much forethought, just full of ego and hormones. I also can't help but think of Ingólfur's wife. He was married at the time, and she was just along for the ride. Like, how did she feel about leaving Norway and living rough in Iceland? Man, am I right? So they arrive in Iceland. Their ships land on the southeastern shore. As the crow flies, that's about 160 miles away from what is now Reykjavík. Ingólfur sends out a couple of slaves in search for pillars he had tossed overboard. And just a short 3 years later, the slaves returned to Ingólfur with news that they found the pillars in Reykjavík, but they weren't impressed with the land there. Ingólfur wasn't bothered by their opinions, though, because the gods had made their decision. The records say that Ingólfur threw the pillars overboard, but since he had slaves with him, I wonder if he didn't tell them to do that for him. And if so, do you suppose the slaves were thinking like, he's going to make us go find those, isn't he? And they were probably all pouty the rest of the voyage. Leif actually only lived in Iceland for about a year because he apparently was an abusive jerk to his slaves, and they killed him a year after they arrived. I saw his behavior towards at least one slave described as quote-unquote cruel and unfair treatment, which leaves a lot to the imagination. In the spring of 875, Leif wanted to cultivate the land, but he only had one ox, so he forced his thrall to pull the plow. The slaves weren't thrilled with this arrangement, so they killed the ox and blamed it on a brown bear, not realizing that brown bear don't exist in Iceland. I don't understand how killing an ox would help with their situation at all, but maybe it was done in, heated emotions. Anyway, Leif and his men went to go look for the bear in the woods, but the slaves attacked them and killed him. The slaves knew Ingólfur would avenge Leif's death, so they fled with the women to what is now called Westman Islands in the south. Irish people were referred to as Westmen at the time, so this was basically like Irish Dude Island, or, Westman Island. So this means that around that time, Ingólfur is learning about his pillars chilling in Reykjavík. He also gets word that his blood brother is dead. He decides one was more pressing than the other and goes to see the body. Saw to it that Leif and his men were buried, then noticed that the boat was missing, so assumed the slaves had gone to the island. In one account, I saw that when he arrived to Westman Island, he found the slaves dining, which left me wanting more description of the scene, so I prayed to the Google gods and found the gross fact that they were surviving on raw seabirds and eggs. Anyway, the slaves fled, but Ingólfur hunted them down and killed them. A year later, in the following spring, Ingólfur, along with his men and wife, and the wives of the killed slaves, settled Reykjavík. Ingólfur managed to make it until 61 years old, until he succumbed to wounds he was awarded with after being ambushed by thieves. Accounts say he seemed to be recovering during the winter, but died in the spring. So there you have it, Iceland's founding as far as I could tell. If you want to learn more about it, you could look up the Book of Settlements or search online. There were other side stories online, but I didn't want to go on too long here. A fun rabbit hole to let yourself slip down into is Icelandic folklore. There's a lot of good information on those interwebs, so, have fun. I'd also recommend Alda Sigmundsdottir's book, Icelandic Folk Legends. I had listened to the audiobook before my trip, and it was great. A big thank you to the public online sources available like Wikipedia, Guide to Iceland, Nordics.info, IcelandOnTheWeb.com, as well as A Pinch of History and History with Hilbert on YouTube. Thank you so much for listening, and if you have any suggestions for other topics, you can leave them in the comments or email me at messymindedpod@gmail.com.